Hey everybody, it's Wes, and we're back with Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of the Lord. It's Friday, November 7th, 2025, and we're filming another podcast episode. All right, so I filmed 2 podcast episodes right back in, I think it was January or February, when I started up the show. And then I stepped away, right? Because, I don't know, you just talk and you talk and you talk and you talk when you do this. I took another job at the time that took up a lot of my time, and I would get home and I would just be like, do I really want to spend all my time on my computer, right? After I have had a stressful day at work, just talking to myself, basically, because that's really what this is. You think about doing a podcast and you really have to have kind of the stamina to just kind of sit down and write out your thoughts and then sit there and just talk about, what's important to you. This podcast is obviously, it revolves around politics and society and culture and then my faith. And so it was just difficult for me to sit down and to have a conversation basically with myself. I talked about wanting to have guests on. That never really materialized for me. And so I stepped away because I was like, I don't know, is this really worth it? Do I really want to invest my time and my energy into this? But then a couple of things happened that, were important in the news cycle. And I have a little bit more free time on my hands right now. And I was like, you know what? I think I want to step back into it. And I'll talk a little bit more about what the motivation was for that at the end of this episode. Obviously, you can kind of see what this episode's going to be about. I've talked about the 2 people, or I've titled the episode after the 2 people that I'd like to cover, Zohran Mamdani and Charlie Kirk. And so maybe you'll see where that's going. But, it wasn't just that it was a full news cycle and a fun hobby. I do think that there's a lot of value in, expressing kind of what you believe, and especially when you express what you believe from a biblical standpoint. And you can kind of get in your head that, maybe your opinion just doesn't matter, or that you don't really have anything new to share. But I do think that in this world where we've got such easy access to a microphone and a unique opportunity to share what we hold so dear, I think that it can be a good thing just to sit down and give it a shot, right? Because you never know where something like this can go. And so that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to film this episode and I'm going to talk about these 2 issues because I really do think that there is a lot to cover right now. All right, so obviously the big news right now is that Zohran Mamdani has been elected the next mayor of New York City, and he's to be sworn into office on January 1st of next year. I didn't even really know if I needed to profile this guy because I feel like everyone kind of knows who he is, but here's just a very quick background of him. So he's 34 years old. He grew up in Kampala, Uganda, before moving to the United States at the age of 7. He's a Muslim and will notably be the first Muslim mayor of New York City. He is of Indian descent. He had a brief stint as a rapper before becoming a New York State assemblyman. He's married with no children. And then his dad is a professor at Columbia University, and his mom is a filmmaker. And then, of course, the big thing with Zohran Mamdani is that he's a self-proclaimed socialist. It's kind of funny. When I started this podcast, I was like, oh, goodness, I'm going to share my political views on the internet. That seems like a risky thing to do, right? I want a job someday that, I don't know, maybe they won't like that I've shared my political views on the internet. And, there's a whole lot of what kind of seems like maybe baggage behind that. But this is a political opinion that I am not afraid to share. And that is that Zohran Mamdani and that socialism is not good for New York City and it's not good for the country. This guy's agenda is crazy, right? Which we're going to get into a little bit later in the podcast. But I think what's really important about Zohran Mamdani right off the bat is to mention that he ran a great campaign. He was a social media giant, right? I think most people my age, I'm 23, most people a little bit older and a little bit younger saw this guy on social media, saw a lot of his supporters on social media, heard a lot about their opinions. There were a lot of street interviews in New York City. It's funny, I could definitely see myself doing street interviews like that. And who knows where this podcast will go. Maybe I'll find myself on the streets of New York City interviewing his supporters. But he was a social media giant, and whoever was running his social media and running his campaign was definitely doing a very good job at getting his message out there. There's something that I want to highlight next because it definitely came across my feed. It came across a lot of my friends' feeds. If people are listening to this podcast who might be a little bit older, you might not have heard this. But Zohran Mamdani almost had like a theme song with his campaign. Notably, Trump had a theme song for his campaigns, right? It was YMCA by the Village People, and that just became kind of like Trump's song, right? And Zohran Mamdani had one too. And so let's take a listen to that quickly.
The name is Mamdani, M-A-M-D-A-N-I. The name is Mamdani, M-A-M-D-A-N-I. You should learn how to say it, M-A-M-D-A-N-I.
All right, so there you have it. At the center of this successful social media campaign was this kind of jingle set to Gwen Stefani's Hollaback Girl. I can't tell you how many times this got stuck in my head, whether reading the news or just thinking about his campaign. This was catchy and it was clever, and whoever came up with it, I mean, they knew how to run a campaign. And agree with Mamdani's politics or not, I think most of the country probably doesn't agree with his politics. Clearly, a majority of New York City does, but agree with his politics or not, he ran a successful social media campaign, and he definitely did that through ways like this. That song, I believe, was kind of born out of people not knowing how to pronounce his name, notably Andrew Cuomo and Curtis Sliwa, who he was running against, and so he also knew how to use the moment and take advantage of something where, you know, his opponents couldn't say his name properly, and he turned it into a viral moment. That clip was screen grabbed off of an account from a woman by the name of Layla Taremi. She describes herself as a New York City content creator. And I believe that I had seen across my page her videos a couple of times, specifically with the use of that sound. And then I think she was with Zohran Mamdani a couple of times when she made her videos. And so I don't know if she was involved in his campaign or not. Certainly, though, that song and his social media movement was not contained to her page, and it definitely wasn't contained to just his campaign either. It certainly swept across social media in New York City and then in the entire country. And I want to talk a little bit about that too, because I really think that it was interesting watching kind of the social media reaction to Zohran's campaign. But before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about why the night was just bad for Republicans across the board, because it wasn't just Zohran Mamdani that won that night. And there's some deeper issues that the Republican Party has as they head into the midterms next year. Of course, all House representatives will be up for re-election, and then a number of senators too, and especially in a couple of swing states. I know that there's one in Georgia in particular that will be a contentious seat. And so, you know, if Republicans want to win, they're going to have to look at what happened in this election cycle, and they're going to have to analyze, you know, what do they do to kind of change their outlook. So with no further ado, let's take a look at some of the numbers. Obviously, there was the New York City mayoral race, but there was also a gubernatorial race in New Jersey, and then there was a gubernatorial race in Virginia as well that got a lot of press. Side note, there was also an AG race that took place in Virginia that many people have probably heard about and got a lot of press. Attorney General races hardly ever get any press, and this one got press largely because the Democratic candidate for Attorney General in the state of Virginia made some off-the-wall comments about wanting the Republican Speaker of the House in the state of Virginia's children dead. It was wild. He won his race, which a lot of people are saying is concerning, and I agree. But ultimately, he probably rode the coattails of Abigail Spanberger, who was the Virginia uh, gubernatorial candidate and who won the governorship. So let's take a look at the numbers quickly. Um, Mikey Sherrill and Jack Ciattarelli ran for governor in the state of New Jersey, and Mikey Sherrill won, receiving, at least this is according to NBC News, 56.5% of the vote. Jack Ciattarelli got 42.9% of the vote. The polls leading up to that election were showing that the race was tightening, and clearly that did not happen. Mikey Sherrill ran away with it with over 10% of the vote, which is crazy because, again, people were saying that it was within 3, 2, 1 points. I think the largest one was a Fox News poll that was around 7 points. But I mean, she's leading right now with just under 14% of the vote. So she ran away with it. It wasn't even close. And what's really important to note about these races is where they stand in light of previous races. So in 2021, there was a New Jersey gubernatorial race. Jack Ciattarelli was also the Republican nominee in that race, and he received 48% of the vote. Of the vote. Phil Murphy, who was the Democratic incumbent in the state, who was running for re-election at the time and is the current governor, received 51.2% of the vote. So it was almost a 3-point race, just about a 3-point race. So Jack Ciattarelli performed considerably worse this time around than he did the time before. Now, there's a whole bunch of reasons that we could attribute that to. Joe Biden was in office, and the president and the national political environment always contributes to races that happen even in local elections. And so you could argue that with Joe Biden in office, and especially right now in a time where everybody just constantly wants political change, right? I mean, we've seen that, right? We had 4 years of Trump, 4 years of Biden. Now we have 4 more years of Trump. What will we see next? Maybe change, because we do seem to live in a very change politics time. You could argue that that's why Jack Ciattarelli performed as well as he did. However, if you look at Trump's standing in New Jersey in the 2024 presidential election, Trump received 45.9% of the vote, where Kamala Harris received 51.8% of the vote. And so Jack Ciattarelli underperformed even Donald Trump in the presidential election last time around, just a year ago. And it's important to note that a couple of counties flipped. So Jack Ciattarelli lost Morris County, which is in northern New Jersey, whereas he won Morris County in the previous election that he ran in, and Trump won Morris County last year. Now, it was very close between Trump and Kamala Harris in Morris County, and it was also close between Jack Ciattarelli and Phil Murphy. Well, it wasn't close, actually. I'm looking at the numbers right here. Phil Murphy lost Morris County by 10% of the vote. So Republicans got to do a lot of soul searching. Jack Ciattarelli was considered to be a good candidate, and to see him backslide as much as he did and then underperform expectations, I think I know the reason for why it happened, but Republicans need to do a lot of soul searching if they want to combat candidates like Zohran Mamdani in the future, right? Because these people were moderate, but they ran away with it. The other race that I mentioned was Virginia. Virginia might be a little bit less telling because the Republican candidate there was Winsome Earl Sears. She was not considered to be nearly as strong of a candidate. She got a lot of press for not receiving an endorsement from Trump, which at the time I didn't even understand why Trump hadn't endorsed her and why she was being painted as a weaker candidate. Well, come to find out that she was very hard on Trump leading up to the election, and then kind of almost seemed like she wanted an endorsement and was going along with his politics. So that's a flip like that with the president of the United States, especially as controversial as this one is, never works to your advantage. So she lost the state of Virginia by, it looks like, almost 15 points, 16 points. Yeah, so it wasn't 15 points. So it wasn't even close. And then in the previous election, Kamala Harris only won the state of Virginia by 5 points. So again, huge difference, right? That's a 10-point difference. 10% of the state of Virginia voted differently than than they did this time around. Now, it's important to note that turnout was obviously not as good in elections like these, but particularly turnout for Republicans. We saw Donald Trump receive 600,000 more votes than Winsome Earl Sears, while Kamala Harris only received 300,000 more votes than Abigail Spanberger. So that in and of itself, I mean, Harris received or half of the increase that Donald Trump received, if you can kind of track my math there. And so it's definitely worth noting that turnout was bad, but you got to consider, I mean, what does turnout look like in elections that don't have Trump in them? Certainly the MAGA coalition kind of falls apart. You have to ask yourself, does the Democratic coalition fall apart because they've built themselves on an anti-Trump vote for so long? Maybe. But again, Republicans really need to do some soul searching, because I believe that what was at the heart of this election was the economy, right? Trump's had some wins abroad recently. He certainly has something to show for in the Middle East right now. He spent a lot of time on that peace deal, and he has a ceasefire that, though maybe shaky, it stands right now in between Israel and Gaza and Hamas, the government there. Foreign policy never wins elections, though, in the United States. People have foreign policy opinions, and Israel has certainly become a hot button issue over the past couple of years, but it doesn't win elections. The economy wins elections, and the money that's in people's pockets wins elections. And so, the economy is not super strong right now. If you will, and I know I don't have that many listeners, so it's not like this actually matters, but I would love if, anybody that is listening would go back. I'm on my friend Ariel Walsh. She has a podcast called Right This Way. And I talked about a little bit earlier this year how I disagree with Trump's economics. And I think his economics are not always super strong. And I think he's really going to have some trouble winning in the midterms if he doesn't get some economic wins. He was in the news the other day talking about how low gas prices are. And he talked about how they were around $2 a gallon, I believe. I don't know what Trump's talking about, but gas is not $2 a gallon right now. I'm looking at AAA's national average for gas, and it's at $3.08 a gallon. Now, there's other reporting out that Walmart apparently is saying that Thanksgiving dinners are going to be cheaper this year. And there's no doubt that Trump has economic policy that can provide some stimulus into the economy. But it's just not enough. The tariffs and his high spending, it contributes to inflation. And unfortunately, the economy works in a certain way where the only two factors that the Fed can kind of tweak and contribute to, well, the only thing that they can control is the money supply, right? That's really the Federal Reserve's main way of controlling the economy. And the only two factors that they can control, which are inverse factors, are unemployment and inflation. So usually the way it tends to go is if you are able to kind of cool down inflation, right, by tightening the money supply, then you tend to have unemployment spike a little bit higher. Or vice versa, if you kind of get a grip on unemployment by, expanding the money supply, then inflation tends to go up a little bit. Right now we have crazy inflation, and people are very concerned about affordability. That's how Zohran Mamdani won his campaign, right? Socialism, because he was arguing that the city wasn't affordable, and people were agreeing. And though Republicans are right to say that socialism will never work, Trump's not providing a clear way of combating the economic challenges that people are having. And so you can understand why people would be intrigued by Mamdani's message. Now, to go back to Mamdani, because that's really what this episode's about, right? Mamdani, and then later Charlie Kirk. To go back to Zohran Mamdani and focus a little bit on those economics. Just because Trump's economics aren't working super well right now, which I'd love to talk about probably more in depth in a later episode, but just because Trump's economics aren't working super well right now doesn't mean you turn to socialism. The things that Zohran Mamdani is promising don't make any sense whatsoever. He's promising free quality childcare across the city, he's promising free bus rides. He's promising free apartments. He's promising, and the craziest one to me is government-run grocery stores. Okay, that's literally what happened in the Soviet Union, and it didn't work. Because how in the world could you have a grocery store where things are either free or heavily subsidized, and you don't have people take advantage of that? Especially in a city like New York City, right? Where there's 8 million people living there. They can all go to the store, right? And just take things off the shelf. Maybe this is obvious, right? But it's clearly not obvious to the people of New York City. And so the next thing I'd like for you to take a listen to is a clip that I pulled from a social media account. It was a street interview, and I'd like you to take a listen to what one voter believed about Zohran Mamdani's economics and his campaign.
Who are you voting for mayor?
I am voting Mamdani
And why?
because he's the most obvious choice.
What makes him an obvious choice for you?
It's just like, I'm trying to think. This reminds me of a certain comedy sketch where the comedian was like, we could either vote in one guy and he's gonna give everybody free houses, free rent, and he's gonna give everybody a Lamborghini, or we could vote in somebody who's gonna burn down the city. That's why I'm voting Mamdani, because I'm voting for the guy who give me the Lamborghini.
Yeah, so you think Mandami's like just gonna give you guys everything?
Not everything. I'm saying it's the most obvious choice.
What do you think is gonna happen with government-run grocery stores and free buses? Do you think that sounds like a good idea?
That does sound like a good idea.
And freezing the rent?
That does sound like a good idea.
What if they have to freeze the rent to the point where eventually then the landlord's not able to come in and fix the washer and make a profit on his own lease?
That's their problem.
What? I mean, I would like to think that most New York City voters are not going about their politics and their economics with that sort of mindset, but I really don't know. Yeah, that's bad. And there's a couple of things to say about that. I mean, first of all, what is she even talking about with the Lamborghinis? Does she think the whole city should have Lamborghinis? I don't think so. Is it a really poor attempt at an analogy? Maybe. Do these people understand the concept of scarcity? Scarcity is like a very basic economic principle, right? That I would think most people understand, and it's simply that there's only so much stuff out there, right? And there's only so much money out there. Money is obviously representative, though, of resources. It's why we don't have to barter with, I don't have to trade you, 3 lambs for 6 oxen or whatever, I may want. I don't have to go to the grocery store and give them a jacket, that I might wear for a couple of lemons or whatever. You get my point. And I don't think these people understand that, like, there's only so much resources out there. And so I wouldn't think that there's just enough Lamborghinis for the entire city of New York City to have one, right? Let alone everyone. Like, clearly there's not a Lamborghini in the world for everybody. And so if Zohran Mamdani can't just hand these people Lamborghinis, he can't just hand them anything, though. He can't just hand them cars. He can't just hand them anything. It's crazy. And then the other thing that I would say directly about what she said was, at the very end of the clip, I hope you catched that he asks her about rent stabilized apartments and if the landlords can't afford to fix amenities like washers and dryers. And she says, well, then that's their problem. Well, ma'am, I don't mean to be rude, but that's your problem, actually. That's not rude. It would be her problem because now she can't wash and dry her clothes. She has a broken washer and dryer, and she can't wash and dry them. Does she think that the government's going to come in and provide a new washer and dryer for her there too? Does she think she'll just walk down to the laundromat and use that? I don't know what she thinks. It doesn't make any sense to me. And I don't think her politics make much sense. And again, I'd like to think that, like, that's not how most people in New York City go about voting for mayor, but I'm really not, I'm not sure. And I mean, we got to get to the bottom of this because this is not a way to run a country. A couple of things that I would say about that on the national scale are, First of all, I mean, on a practical sense, well, okay. So whether or not Zoran Mamdani is actually going to be able to implement his policy is a totally different question. He can't do alone the tax increases that he wants. He wants to do a 2% tax increase on, I think it's just people, he says millionaires. I don't know exactly what his threshold is for that, but he wants to do a 2% tax increase. Whether or not that will drive people out of New York City is kind of a moot point, in my opinion, because he can't pass that legislation on his own. He needs the New York State Assembly to pass that for him, which is interesting because you would think that he would be able to apply some sort of a local levy, but he can't. And so it'll be interesting to see whether or not he can implement any of the policy that he wants to implement. Kathy Hochul, the current governor of New York, notably endorsed Zoran Mamdani over her former boss, Andrew Cuomo. I don't know if that was kind of like a spiteful thing or what was going on, but she endorsed Zoran Mamdani. And then she said that she doesn't endorse his policy on taxation, which is literally like the foundation of his campaign. And so that was interesting because she doesn't endorse that. There was a chant, and I forget exactly. I think it was a tax the rich chant. Let me look here because it was so good. And it was such a crazy, tax the rich. And she was present. It was at a looks like a party in Brooklyn. And the chant began tax the rich. Hochul's photo appeared. This is a Fox News article on the big screen. Blah, blah, blah. Kathy Hochul then goes on to say that she didn't think that they were saying tax the rich. She thought that they were saying, let's go Bills. Okay, yes. So here it is. Tax the rich. Hochul responds, I can hear you, to a stadium that erupted with the chant. And then again, she says that she thinks they're saying, let's go Bills. Let's go Bills and tax the rich don't sound anything like each other. So that's just audacious in its own right. And so it'll be interesting to see whether or not he can apply any of the stuff that he ran on. Certainly he can do things like defund the police, which is something that he did say at one point he wanted to do. I don't know if he'll do that or not. He said he's keeping the current police commissioner in her position, and so it doesn't seem like he's leaning that way anymore. I would like to think that when you actually get the responsibility to run something like a city, you realize that people's lives are in your hands if you do something like defund the police. And so I would like to think that he has enough of a conscience to say, I'm not going to make my city unsafe, and I don't want people to suffer the consequences of that. But I don't know. That seems like his most tangible thing that he can do if he can't get the taxation that he wants. And so, yeah, maybe he will. Maybe he will do things like defund the police. Also, I mean, it's definitely important to talk about the fact that we do send federal dollars to New York City, and I don't get a free Lamborghini. So I don't exactly want the people of New York City getting a free Lamborghini with my tax money. Now, I don't know that Trump will have the political wherewithal and the political stamina to say, I'm not going to send federal funds to New York City. I don't even know if that's a good political decision, but it's definitely, something to consider when New York offers all of these proposals and benefits to their citizens, because money is fungible. If you send money for something and they don't necessarily even apply that money to the programs that we're talking about, it's still, they're being given money and then they're spending money somewhere else. And if you pull your money, then maybe they would use the money that they're applying somewhere else to apply for the things that you're pulling it from. And so money's fungible, and it'll be interesting to see if the president has any way to stand up to Mamdani's policy if he really does go off the socialist deep end here. But really, I think the final point that I want to make on Mamdani, and I've heard this coined a couple of different places, and I really think that this is at the heart of our politics today, and that's that a lot of these people seem like they just have luxury views, right? I don't know exactly who coined that term, luxury views, but it really is something that it seems like this girl who gave that interview on the street and many others kind of operate based on. And it's just, they don't have to suffer the consequences of their actions. And I don't know that the consequences in New York City are going to be so acute that people will look at Mamdani and say, "Oh man, you're, so socialist that I regret voting for you," or "You're so socialist that I'd rather vote for a different person." But I mean, we have seen that in countries like Venezuela, right? Venezuela at one point was one of the richest countries in the world, and then they shifted to socialism, and now look at them. They're in total despair. And so I really do think that it boils down to just this kind of understanding of politics, and not understanding that there's consequences to the way that you vote, consequences to your actions. It's one reason why I'm always hesitant. I don't think politics should take over anyone's life. That's from a Christian standpoint, right? Because you don't you don't want the general population to be so ingrained in politics that they forget about things that are more important, right? Like going and living your life, right? It's more important for most people to focus on their lives, right? Their families, to focus on their faith, to focus on just even just the little things in life, right? Then get wrapped around with politics, wrapped around the axle with politics. But also, you do need to be aware. And that's why when people are like, well, I don't really pay attention to politics because I don't know, it just like stresses me out or whatever. I'm hesitant because I'm like, I understand what you're saying. And I do think that you should put a greater focus on faith in your life, especially if you're not someone like me who's studied political science before, or who's, just devoted a lot of time to understanding how the government works. I had a government position at one point. I enjoy this, and I do think that it's one of my skills, and I'd like to steward that well. But the general population shouldn't get wrapped around the axle, is my point. However, at the same time, you got to pay attention, and you got to know how you're voting. And it's not good enough to just be like, oh, well, I don't know, it doesn't really affect me, because it will affect you. At some point, decisions catch up to you, right? Or they catch up to your children, or they catch up to future generations, right? And it's not good enough to just be like, oh, I've got this luxury view and I get to just kind of sit back and let the world kind of operate the way it operates. Because at some point, it catches up with you, whether that's economically, like we've seen in Venezuela, like we may see in New York City, or whether it's in a different regard, right? I mean, you have wars that break out in other countries. And just because we are, on the other side of two big oceans doesn't mean that we couldn't have fallout here, some sort of issue here. So you got to pay attention, and you've got to stand up against things like socialism and against political candidates like Zohran Mamdani, and you got to stay focused, and you got to let your views be known, and it's not just good enough to have a very privileged outlook on life and to think that it will never affect you, because at some point it will. All right, so that leads us to the second portion of this show, which is Charlie Kirk's life and legacy. I'm going to admit, I recorded this segment and then I went back and I listened to it, and I thought that it was okay, but I just scrapped it because I just didn't think it did Charlie Kirk's life justice. And I wanted to speak about this in a very specific way, and I didn't feel like I did that the first time around. So here's hoping that this time around is a little bit better, because I'll admit that before Charlie Kirk died, I didn't really know how I felt about he, or Turning Point for that matter. I'd obviously seen his clips online, and I agreed with much of what he said, but I also disagreed with some of what he said too. And I don't know, I thought sometimes he was too hard on college students. I kind of know what that's like to be in that position. I definitely don't say a lot of what the students that he was going up against said, but I just thought to myself sometimes, is it really biblically grounded to go and absolutely like destroy these kids on stage? So I didn't know how I felt about him. But then, what happened in October, and like much of the country, I went back and I listened to a lot of what Charlie Kirk said. I read a lot of what he'd posted, and my view on him totally changed. And I think it's really important to highlight that again in a clear and concise way, because there's nothing to disagree with about Jesus defeated death so you can live, which is a Charlie Kirk tweet that he posted. It looks like on September 6th, 2025, maybe. It's a little unclear on his social media account, but tweets like that, right? Or reading the Bible is good for the soul. That's another Charlie Kirk tweet. Looks like on 8/18/25. And I could go on and on, right? He was constantly posting the gospel message, and there's no arguing that. And there's obviously I would never argue with that. And what Charlie Kirk seemed to understand so well and seemed to apply so much better than many of us can is that your faith has to permeate every aspect of your life, right? If you believe that Jesus died on the cross and was raised 3 days later and changes your life, right? It changes everything. And if you believe that, then it has to affect everything, politics included. And I think a lot of people are growing to understand that their faith has to impact every area of their life, but it's very easy to compartmentalize politics. It's easy to sit here and say, well, I don't know everything, and I certainly don't know much about this. And as we've talked a little bit earlier, it can just be very stressful. And so it's easy to say, I don't know, I'm not going to talk about how my faith impacts my politics. But Charlie Kirk, he didn't let that mindset affect the way that he worked. And I think that legacy is incredibly important for Christians in the media. And it was so clear in the way that he went about things. You know, as somebody that's like, oh, maybe I'll get into podcasting, it would be really easy to sit here and go, well, I'm going to start a podcast as a young whatever. I don't know what I really label myself, but as a young conservative, let's just say, and say, cuss a little bit, right? And be like, oh yeah, I'm going to say whatever. But what Charlie Kirk did was so countercultural, right? He didn't cuss on his show, and he told his guests that when they came on, and it was just so countercultural. And it really, I think, shared the gospel in a unique way in a sphere where not many people were willing to kind of merge the two and step into that. And it's okay to not always know how you feel about a certain issue or to change your opinion on certain things. I think Charlie Kirk changed his opinion on specifically economics as his politics kind of progressed. But he was adamant that his faith had to impact every aspect of his life. And he was very good about that. I think another thing that we can take away from Charlie Kirk's life was that he clearly, there was more for him than just politics too. There's a video that I would love to post, but I don't think I can do it justice because you kind of got to watch it, and I don't have a video component to this podcast. But basically, Erica Kirk just posted this video where Charlie's walking around town with his daughter, and it's very motivational in a way, right? Because you see a guy who he loved politics, but clearly he had other priorities as well, right? He had a wife and he had 2 children. And I don't see how anybody could look at that life and not be inspired and not walk away from that and say, regardless of what his views are, he had a clear message. And if that clear message is the gospel, sure, you can't throw away everything else, right? You got to contextualize people. Some people say things gospel oriented and then act in a way that's very like opposing to that. And you're like, oh my gosh, how do you dichotomize those two things? But Charlie Kirk, he wasn't that radical. Again, he was mischaracterized by clips of him on the internet that were taken out of context, and I just don't think that's fair at all. And I think it's important to speak out on that, right? I think so many Americans found themselves after his death seeing what came through on their feeds and being like, this isn't who I thought this was. And it inspires me as somebody that's looking into this kind of media venture type thing, because I look at, the podcasting format and I'm like, this is a great opportunity to intertwine politics, intertwine my faith, and really just to kind of to share the message of the gospel and to talk about what I'd like to think I know a little bit about, and that's politics and the economy and kind of how government works and operates and what I think is going to happen. I guess one other thing that I would say about Charlie Kirk is he clearly understood his constituency, which was young Americans. that's kind of why we're talking about Charlie Kirk and Zohran Mamdani in the same episode, because though they did not share hardly probably any opinions, right? You had a Muslim mayor of New York City who was a socialist, and then you had a conservative Christian free market capitalist, right, who went from college to college advocating for the pro-life cause and for a whole litany of conservative ideals. But they clearly both had kind of a similar constituency, right? And that was young Americans who were facing unique challenges, whether that is, the inability to purchase a house or coming out of college, not really knowing that your degree is going to count for much. They clearly had very similar constituencies. And though they took vastly different approaches, one of which, Zohran Mamdani's, was pretty terrible, and I think across the board we can agree that socialism isn't going to work. I would imagine if you're listening to this podcast would think that. They had the same constituency, right? And going into the midterms here, it will be interesting because if somebody doesn't figure that out, then it's not going to be good for whoever ignores young Americans' issues, because they were clearly willing to vote for Donald Trump last election cycle when they felt like he kind of bucked the status quo, and they were clearly willing to vote for Zohran Mamdani in New York City when they felt like he bucked the status quo. And so I think Charlie Kirk understood that. I think he understood who his constituency was. And I think that he was willing to fight for young Americans. And I think that that's a very honorable thing to do. I guess the final thing that I would leave you with is a very simple Charlie Kirk quote. His account posted it on August 3rd. It got a lot of traction after his death, and so I'm sure you've heard this. But Charlie Kirk simply said that Jesus is the answer. Doesn't get any better than that. And it doesn't get any more simple than that. I think that's about as concisely as you can share the gospel. Despite your political views, that really is truth that you can apply to your life no matter what. And so that would be my final encouragement for the day, for this episode, is that Jesus is the answer. So whatever you're up to for, whenever you listen to this, I would just encourage you to take that with you and to let it affect not only politics, but every aspect of your life. Go in peace and God bless. Thanks for listening.